U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping have held talks on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea, marking yet another critical moment in the complex dance of international diplomacy between the world's two largest economies. The narrative since the trade deal between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, which followed last week's meeting, has generally been positive, conveying an air of cautious optimism. President Trump expressed confidence about securing a fair and balanced trade deal with China, underscoring his belief that productive negotiations could lead to mutual benefits. However, he also tempered expectations, warning that the highly anticipated one-to-one meeting with President Xi at the APEC summit next week might not unfold as expected. So now we're going to have a fair deal. I think we're going to have a very successful meeting. Certainly, there are a lot of people that are waiting for it. Maybe it won't happen, Trump remarked, reflecting both hope and the ever-present uncertainty in high-level diplomacy. At the 2025 APEC summit in Gyeongju, a single meeting quietly shifted the atmosphere across Asia. Japan's new Prime Minister, Sonai Taki, sat down with President Xi Jinping of China, and beneath the surface of polite diplomacy, something far more consequential was developing. Their conversation carried the accumulated weight of decades of rivalry, partnership, and interdependence, all converging in a moment that could reshape the regional landscape. Beneath the formal smiles and handshake photo opportunities, both sides were reassessing their place in a rapidly changing global order. For the first time in generations, Japan seemed willing to reconsider where its true alliances should lie, and the potential consequences extended far beyond Asia's borders. The meeting drew polite applause from the press, but inside diplomatic circles, the tone was anything but routine. Senior officials revealed that the discussions went well beyond surface-level trade figures and public statements. This was not about optics or ceremonial gestures, but about fundamentally reevaluating the balance of power in the region. Sources close to Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs indicated that both delegations explored a new framework for regional cooperation, one that no longer assumed Washington's dominance as its foundation. President Xi spoke of stability and shared development, emphasizing a vision of mutual growth, while Prime Minister Taki highlighted the need for restored trust, pragmatic dialogue, and long-term partnership. Both leaders recognized the gravity of the moment. Beneath the formalities was a rare sense of candor, an acknowledgement that Asia's future might require a novel kind of collaboration, one that did not automatically defer to the United States. Analysts from outlets such as Nikkei Asia and the Financial Times quickly observed that this was far more than a symbolic meeting. It reflected a broader strategic recalibration, driven by Japan's growing frustration with Washington's policies. The return of Donald Trump to the White House had reignited a hardline American trade agenda, marked by higher tariffs, renegotiated agreements, and renewed import restrictions. Japan, despite decades of alliance, was increasingly treated not as a trusted partner but as another competitor. Exports to the United States were taking hits from protectionist measures, and Japan's manufacturing giants were absorbing the shock. Each new American policy deepened Tokyo's dilemma: remain loyal to its oldest ally or seek breathing room elsewhere. China, ever strategic and observant, moved quickly to capitalize on Japan's unease. In the weeks leading up to Gyeongju, Beijing extended a comprehensive offer that included joint ventures in energy, technology, and infrastructure, along with tariff reductions for Japanese products entering Chinese markets. Additionally, China proposed measures aimed at easing military tensions in the East China Sea. Behind closed doors, Chinese officials reportedly floated an informal memorandum promising to limit naval and air activity near Japan's zones of control, contingent on the advancement of political and economic cooperation. For Japan, long accustomed to Chinese aircraft skirting its airspace and vessels edging near disputed waters, the proposal was extraordinary. The combination of reduced tension and greater access to the Chinese market provided Tokyo with leverage that it had not wielded in years. Yet this leverage came with significant consequences. In Washington, the reaction was swift and cautious. Reports from Reuters described unease within the White House, where senior advisors warned that Beijing's overtures could be interpreted as an attempt to buy influence in Tokyo. American officials claimed such developments could weaken the Trans-Pacific security framework that had anchored U.S. power in Asia for decades. Within Japan, however, perceptions were evolving. The foreign policy establishment had grown weary of walking the narrow line between loyalty and self-interest. Political scientist Kazuo Sasaki of the Tokyo Institute for International Studies observed that Japan's leadership no longer wanted to act as an extension of U.S. strategy. Instead, they sought independence and the ability to make sovereign decisions without constant oversight or approval from Washington. The economic situation only intensified the urgency. The yen had been sliding to historic lows, while the dollar's strength magnified the cost of imports. Japanese corporations, squeezed by declining exports and rising production costs, began exploring ways to conduct trade in alternative currencies. During the Gyeongju Summit, the idea of conducting direct transactions in Chinese yuan gained attention. Chinese banks reportedly presented Tokyo with a plan to bypass the dollar-based SWIFT system entirely. Publicly, this was framed as a technical adjustment, but insiders viewed it as the early step in a broader financial transformation. Economists began describing this shift as the yuanization of the Pacific, signaling more than just a monetary adjustment. It represented a gradual rebalancing of financial power across Asia. If trade between two of the world's largest economies began operating outside the dollar's orbit, the ripple effects would be felt from Seoul to Singapore and ultimately Wall Street. Yet currency realignment was only one part of the story. Military analysts noted that even as China extended economic incentives, its naval presence near Japanese waters continued to expand. However, these maneuvers appeared measured, projecting strength while leaving communication channels open. Beijing seemed to be offering an implicit bargain: stability at sea in exchange for cooperation on land and in trade. Experts suggest that this trade-off formed the quiet centerpiece of the Shidokai dialogue. Japan's leadership recognized the complexity of the offer. Its post-war security has long been bound to the United States, with American bases dotting the archipelago and defense guarantees forming the backbone of national security policy. Yet this alliance, once rock-solid, had begun to feel uncertain as Washington's priorities shifted under Trump's transactional approach, raising difficult questions in Tokyo about the sustainability of long-term reliance on the United States. The mood in Japan's political class could be described as cautious yet pragmatic. By contrast, the U.S. response carried an edge of irritation. Following the summit, President Trump publicly reminded audiences that American taxpayers fund Japan's defense, a statement that reverberated across both capitals. Behind the scenes, outlets such as Bloomberg and Politico reported growing concern within the administration, aware that losing Japan's loyalty could destabilize the entire U.S. security structure in East Asia. Timing also added pressure. Only days before meeting Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Taki had met with Trump at the same summit. That conversation reportedly turned tense when Trump demanded that Japan increase purchases of American natural gas and reduce its trade surplus. Takaichi refused to commit, citing Japan's economic interests, which diplomatic circles interpreted as a subtle but clear message that Tokyo was exploring alternatives. The broader implications of these developments reach far beyond trade or economics. A new pattern of regional alignment is emerging, one that could see Beijing positioned as the primary hub of Asia's economy, with Tokyo playing a central but independent role, rather than serving as a subordinate ally of the United States. Chinese and Japanese delegations have reportedly continued consultations post-summit, discussing infrastructure projects, collaboration on green technology, and Japan's potential participation in certain Belt and Road initiatives. Officially, these talks are framed as pragmatic cooperation. Unofficially, however, they represent the early construction of an Asia-centered economic order. If this process continues, the strategic map of the Pacific could shift dramatically. Japan, once anchored firmly in the U.S.-led framework, may begin defining its own independent path, marking one of the most significant geopolitical adjustments in the region since the end of World War II. To many in Tokyo, this evolution feels necessary. The global landscape has changed, and clinging to Cold War-era dynamics no longer guarantees stability or prosperity. China's rise, America's unpredictability, and global market volatility have compelled Japan to adapt. However, adaptation carries risk. Aligning too closely with Beijing could expose Japan to political pressure and economic dependency of another kind. while moving away from Washington could weaken the security guarantees that have protected the nation for decades. The challenge for Taki's government is to find a balance that preserves sovereignty without sacrificing safety. In the United States, reactions have shifted from concern to quiet alarm. Policymakers are beginning to realize that years of trade friction and protectionist policies may have accelerated the very outcome they hope to avoid. Japan's gradual pivot toward China is not a sudden betrayal but the result of accumulated frustration, and unless Washington crafts a new vision, one that treats Tokyo as an equal partner rather than a client, the shift may soon become irreversible. President Trump's America First policy, intended to protect U.S. interests, may inadvertently drive its key ally closer to Beijing. If that occurs, the Asia-Pacific region will enter a new phase in which the familiar post-war balance of power begins to fracture, and the alliances that once defined the international order fade into history. Compounding these geopolitical shifts, China's export engine is showing signs of strain. October brought the sharpest downturn since February, indicating that U.S. tariffs are beginning to bite into one of the world's most powerful manufacturing sectors. After months of front-loading shipments to preempt Trump's renewed tariffs, Chinese exporters finally hit a wall. The numbers reveal a stark reality. China, despite years of diversification, still relies heavily on American demand. U.S. consumers account for over $400 billion worth of Chinese goods annually, and losing even a fraction of that market has immediate consequences. Economists estimate that tariffs alone have shaved approximately 2 percentage points off China's export growth, cutting around 0.3% from national GDP. The market reacted swiftly. The Chinese yuan slipped against the dollar, posting its first weekly decline in a month as traders absorbed the weaker data. Despite these challenges, there was a brief pause in trade tensions. Following weeks of uncertainty, Presidents Trump and Xi agreed on a temporary tariff truce, deciding to scale back some measures for a year. The deal eased investor concerns over further escalation. Yet even with partial rollbacks, Chinese goods destined for the U.S. continue to face tariffs near 45%, levels that many economists believe erode profit margins across a broad range of industries. According to economist Woi Chen-ho of UOB Singapore, the truce may offer a short period of stability, but both nations are preparing to reduce dependency on one another by restructuring supply chains and safeguarding against future shocks. China's trade surplus with the U.S. still rose in October, reaching nearly $25 billion, up from roughly $23 billion the previous month. Meanwhile, Beijing pursued new agreements with other partners, including the European Union, where discussions over trade and investment deals continue. China's surplus with the EU now sits near $22 billion, underscoring Europe's growing importance as an alternative market. Domestically, however, the picture remains challenging. Weak internal demand limits the extent to which China can rely on itself. Imports in October rose by only 1%, the slowest pace in 5 months. Analysts at Nomura warn that the combination of weak exports, soft retail sales, and fragile consumer confidence could force Beijing to prioritize short-term stabilization over long-term reform, relying on fiscal expansion, government-led spending, and investment to keep growth from falling too far below targets. For now, China faces a complex balancing act, rebuilding export strength without escalating tensions with Washington, expanding domestic consumption while managing debt, and cultivating new trade partners to fill the gap left by the U.S. The coming months will test whether Beijing can adapt quickly enough to withstand both external pressure and internal slowdown. Should these headwinds persist, the world's second-largest economy may enter 2026 carrying the heaviest strain it has faced in over a decade, with economic ripples felt far beyond China's borders. The APEC summit and the quiet diplomacy unfolding in Asia thus stand at the center of a momentous period, with global trade, alliances, and power structures all in flux.